This conference will now be recorded.
We're rolling.
Sweet.
All right, guys, we're gonna get going. That's the best chair in the house. Okay, cool. Welcome. I'm so stoked you guys came out tonight. This is something totally new that we're trying. And we read one of Heather's books for our book club a couple months back. Loved it. She came out with a new book just in November. That's Powder Days. And what we're here to discuss tonight. And I'll just read a brief bio of Heather. And then what we're going to do, she's going to do a little reading from the book. And then we're going to do a little Q&A. So this handy dandy owl right here is a 360 camera. It's watching you and it can hear you. So maybe speak up a little bit if you want to pose the question, but feel free. Hopefully this is a pretty interactive session. So Heather is the author of Powder Days and Downriver. She is an outside environmental columnist and contributing editor. She's a skier, boater, and mountain lover. She's originally from the East Coast and now resides in Seattle. So cheers, welcome Heather.
Hey, thanks for having me. Oh, I'm getting that weird echo of myself again. Are you guys hearing that?
Okay, try it again.
I still hear it. I can try and deal with it if it doesn't come through on your end. Oh, now I think it's gone.
Okay, how about now when we're talking?
I'll just keep talking and see if it happens. I think that's fine now. Yeah, I don't know what you did, but it's magic. Thank you everyone for being here. I know that Zoom chats aren't the most ideal form for doing this kind of thing, but I'm psyched to get to talk about the new book with you all. And like Taylor said, this book is called Powder Days. It just came out about a month ago now in early November. And it's sort of about the idea of being a ski bum and living the dream, and then why that dream isn't always a reality and what the hard parts are, which I'm hoping and guessing a lot of people in Crested Butte and in the room tonight have thoughts and feelings about. So I figured I'd start us off with just a little bit from the introduction so I can give you guys a little taste of how the book is framed up and kind of what it sounds like. So I'll do that and then we can kind of roll into a chat. So this is just from the very beginning, the introduction. And the section is called The Dream. We duck our heads into the wind, ski tips skittering as we curve along the ridge, slowing down to scout the gullies and pick our lines. Katie drops in first, and from above I watch her turn, every arc short but smooth. She sends down a wave of slough as she carves through the chute, whooping, more graceful than I'll ever be. In the apron, she stops below a knuckle of rock, out of the line of fire if I were to fall or if the slope were to slide, and waves me down. I lean forward in my boots and tilt over the edge, giving into gravity. This rim of rocky chutes was out of bounds when we ski patrolled here at Arapahoe Basin almost a decade ago. Back then, the only way into the steep gullies was to wait for conditions to line up, then duck a rope and sneak around the elbow of the ridge, hoping no one saw you go, hoping that the sugary Colorado snowpack would be stable when you did. I followed older guys past the boundaries, nervous but glad to be invited, hopped up on a mixture of adrenaline, secrets, and the thrill of breaking rules. Now the gullies are inbounds, kicked open by the pressure of resort expansion and skiers hungry for terrain. From the ridge, you can see down to Highway 6, where the real dirtbag skiers used to park their campers, sleeping close to the hill, cutting corners wherever they could. These days, traffic stacks up on the road, and you're not allowed to sleep in your vehicle anymore. It feels like all of Denver drives to the mountains every weekend, cramming the slopes, skiing off every bit of snow. It seems sometimes like there are no more secrets. Part of that is true. It has changed. It's crowded, more expensive, and more exposed. But my frustration is also driven by the shifting baseline of nostalgia and the way the past resonates and echoes when I'm back in a place that used to be mine. Even if things had remained the same, we would be different. Katie has a kid now, and I live 7 states away. We no longer subsist on quesadillas and highlight, and we're back here in passing. We're not locals anymore, even when I still try to hold on to those dirtbag secrets and claim them as mine. But we were ski bums once, or at least we were skiers chasing the idea of wildness, helixed around an obsession with untouched snow, and the kind of parties where someone often ended up naked shooting fireworks out of their ass. For a while, we were insiders, stratified into the mountain town ecosystem, shiny in our youth and ease, even when we were serving pizza a second shift to supplement our skimpy on-mountain paychecks. Even when we were stamping our feet in the bitter cold, scanning lift tickets while some sweaty second homeowner accused us of ruining his vacation. We were living the dream, prioritizing skiing over everything else, heavy on the quote unquote. We moved to the mountains and let the other facets of our lives fall into place from there. It was an idea I'd been obsessed with since I was a kid, when I first felt the adrenal glory of downhill motion, lit from behind by the perfect sunset shots of ski movies and glossed up by magazines. I thought that being a skier, a real skier, meant committing to that constant sense of chase. But like any obsession, the reality was more complicated. Even calling yourself a bum signals a level of privilege. There's an imbalance that comes from chasing something fleeting and selfish, because it can all fall apart one bad fall. Ski towns and the built-up fantasy land of resorts can be havens for inequality and abuse. Skiers are drawn to excess, and there's plenty to go around. When I moved to Colorado in 2005, risk was everywhere, but in a way that felt exciting. I liked the brag of drinking too much, and I was too naive to notice harder drugs. Climate change seemed vague and theoretical, and no one I knew had died in the mountains yet. The recession hadn't shaken my generation's idea of stability, and corporate entities were just starting to binge buy resorts. I didn't understand the direct connection between my rampant anxiety and my relentless impermanence, and I thought living in my car was cool. I thought I could exist like that forever. But skiers know that a turn only looks elegant when it's in motion. It breaks down and loses its grace if you stop moving. And ski bumming is kind of the same. It exists in a liminal space, one that seems particularly fragile now as resorts consolidate, climate change accelerates, and economic inequality underscores existing disparities that concentrate in vacation towns. Personally, politically, and ecologically, skiing is changing. It's hard to live forever in the bubble, and it's particularly hard when it's squeezed by unreal expectations and shrinking spaces. Ski culture glorifies its iconoclasts. That means that skiers have been fed a narrow ideal that's nearly impossible to achieve, which feels like a story about much more than skiing. So that's just a little slice from the intro.
Sweet. And what town were you writing about, particularly in that passage? Because it really feels like you could have been writing about any ski town.
Yeah, and as a aside for tonight, one of the people that I first scanned the tickets with is in the house tonight. So Sarah Coleman probably has a little bit of insight in this. But I moved to Beaver Creek, to Avon, kind of right after college with two of my best friends from college. And so a lot of that sort of initial idea was there. And I was there for a couple of years. And then I was in Summit County where I was ski patrolling. So it's a little bit of a mishmash of those years together. But yeah, I tell people that I lived in all the least cool places, ski towns in Colorado. So if I had done it right, maybe I would have moved to Crested Butte. But I was like a kid from Massachusetts, kind of guessing at where to go.
Sweet. So why skiing? What drew you to the sport, and why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, I think those are two kind of big questions. I think that I'm somebody, I guess my family always skied a little bit. I grew up, like we would go to the local kind of locally run ski area. We do after school ski lessons. But I really got into skiing in high school, and I went to a big kind of urban high school. But my school had a program where if you sold breakfast at the high school, you got to ski for free, which is sort of a great, like one of the issues with skiing, I think now, is that the barriers to entry can be so high and it's so expensive. But I had this kind of like line into skiing, and it became this thing that was like a way to feel adventurous and exciting. And it, made me feel like I was independent, kind of like the cool older kids were doing it. So I kind of very early on got obsessed with skiing as this like way to be brave and to be in the mountains. That kind of carried me through high school and college. And after college, I moved, I think I kind of alluded to it in that section, but I sort of had this idea that I think is kind of couched in a lot of ideas about America and adventure and kind of Western exploration, that I could move to the mountains and I would kind of be this like brave, exciting person if I did that. And so I kind of did that on a whim, and that choice has since shaped so many other pieces of my life, and kind of how, skiing has been this through line, and how I, decide where to live, what I do for work, who my friends and the people in my community are. And so that idea, like about how something can root so deep for me and for other people, was really interesting to me. And in that world of skiing, it felt like there weren't really any books or anything that I had read that kind of spoke to that talked about, kind of like the shiny sides of skiing and the reason why it's, why people get obsessed with it and why there's nothing else that kind of feels like that, but also the things that make sort of committing your life to skiing hard and unrealistic, and that make it complicated, and, like all these things, climate change, economic ability, racism, all these things that we're kind of sitting with in a lot of ways right now that come to a head really concretely in skiing. It felt like there wasn't anything kind of looking at that or answering those questions. So I think when you think about writing a book, part of it is like trying to fill a void and, and trying to tell a story that hasn't been told before. And this really felt like something that I hadn't seen that done, or hadn't seen that story told in a way that felt true to me. So selfishly, I wanted to like dig into my own obsession, and it felt like kind of a bigger story too.
Yeah, so that story that you mentioned, that kind of shows the whole picture of ski culture and ski life, and kind of busting the myth of ski bumming and this glorified lifestyle. Do you think that this is a recent phenomenon? Like, do you think this book could have been written, let's say, 8 years ago, which is what I talked to you briefly about over email before this talk? I wish this book had been written before I moved to the mountains, so I could kind of take off the rose-colored glasses and, oh, this is complicated. There's a lot of dynamics that go into ski towns.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two sides to that. On some level, I think that this book could have been written anytime. There's one of the things that I think is like the pieces of history that I glommed onto is that there's sort of been this narrative of the ski bum is dead since the 60s, like kind of since skiing started. Like there's kind of always been this nostalgia factor, and people have kind of, almost everyone I talked to in doing research for the book was like, I was the last generation that could like really get in and do it right. And that was like, whether they moved to Aspen in the 70s or Jackson in the 90s, there's kind of this constant sense of like, oh, you should have been here yesterday. Like, it's really great. So I think on some level, this feeling of like, is this thing that we love sort of disappearing is perennial, or like is often part of the story. But I do think on some level, a lot of the things are harder now. I know you guys are thinking a lot about housing there, like these issues that really pressurize what it means to live in the mountains are really front of mind for a lot of people right now. So on some level, I think, yeah, like this book could have been written 8 years ago. It could have probably been written 80 years ago. But I think hopefully, I think the conversation is changing currently. Maybe I'm too far down the wormhole, but it does feel like it's kind of like top of mind for a lot of people.
Great, yeah. You did definitely get into a lot of the history, and I loved reading about the glory days of the 70s. But really, I think your point was that glory days are every day. But I don't want to monopolize the conversation with you here, so I'm going to throw it to the audience now and see if there's any questions that have arisen from these first couple of questions.
Heather, can you hear us?
I can, yeah. The owl eyeball isn't shifting, but I can hear you guys.
The books are talking to you, it looks like. When did you give up the ski bum life?
When did I give it up?
Yeah, were you ever a ski bum? It seemed like it from your writing.
Yeah, I think, somebody was asking me that today and they were like, do you still think of yourself as a ski bum? And I think part of it is it's hard to self-define. Like, I feel like you can't be like, I'm that. Somebody else has to call you that. And I moved, I guess to answer your question, I moved out of the mountains. I moved down to Boulder to go to journalism school in 2010. So I've been out of it I haven't been doing the kind of like seasonal work on the mountain thing for a long time. But I slimeballed the system. I started working for magazines after that. I worked for Skiing Magazine, and then I worked for Powder for a couple years, and then I became freelance and started working for myself, which I think in some ways is sort of like the ultimate slimeball dirtbagging move, because I still get to be in the mountains a lot and be writing about it. But I haven't, but on some level, I kind of feel like I'm on the outside looking in.
I guess it kind of felt the way that you wrote the book. So sorry if I jumped to that conclusion that you had given it up.
And I think, and that's something, I mean, a lot of this, one of the threads of the book is sort of like me watching, my friends who are still keep trolling and who are trying to have kids or buy houses or things like that, and watching the struggles they face in that, and sort of me looking back and trying to decide for myself if I made the right choice on giving up on that, and sort of like at what level can you hold on to that obsession and connection and still have other parts of your, like, how does the ski bum grow up, I think is one of the questions that felt like it was core to the book, and is like still something that I'm thinking about a lot in my own life. And I feel like I sort of came out of the research for this book with more questions than I had going in.
Was there a common thread that you noticed or characteristic about the ski bums that you profiled? And I hate to use that word. I talked about it as a derogatory term in some ways, and how you're not comfortable with it. And to call anybody a bum feels a little.
I think I don't love that phrase. Like, it feels a little too, I don't know, cheesy maybe is the right word. And one of my favorite little anecdotes about it is that I was talking to Chris Patterson, who's now the director of Warren Miller, and he's somebody who'd spent a lot of time with Warren Miller, and Warren Miller's kind of this like archetype skier storyteller, and who often gets called the ultimate ski bum. And Chris was saying, he's like, Warren told me he hated that phrase because he wanted to be like, I wasn't a bum, I was working like 5 jobs. You can't call me a bum. So I think that I don't like that phrase, but I kind of struggle with the finding like exactly what the right word is to describe it. But I think sort of some of the most interesting parts of the research for me were, that was kind of surprising that I hadn't initially thought of, that would be kind of a big part of the book, were digging into kind of the psychology and brain science behind why certain people feel like have a greater need for risk than others, and why certain people can like commit to instability or things like that. And there's sort of like 5 main personality traits that everyone has in some kind of combination. And one of them is what they call sensation seeking. And it's just this idea that like you need more feeling and intensity and adrenaline than other people might. And we all have set points for this. Like, everybody has it in some level, but there are people who need that physical feeling and like dopamine and adrenaline and need that more. And the more I dug into that side of it, that felt like one of the really common threads, that there are people who just like something in their biochemistry really just sets them up to want to chase feeling. And so I think that's sort of an interesting way of thinking of it too, where it's like, okay, this is just an inborn need in you. Because sometimes I have, for myself even, I have trouble explaining why skiing feels important, and why something that like I objectively know is kind of ridiculous has been such a big part of my life. And so I think having that kind of like way to work back the brain science has been really interesting for me. And that just seems like, that's a common thread. There's also, they call it, another trait that they call antisocial behavior. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't like people or you're not social, but it just means that you don't play by the rules of society very well, and you kind of want to carve out your own path. And, kind of you're skeptical of norms in society, and that felt like another really common thread too, that, pretty much everyone I talked to for the book, and, a lot of people I know in my own life, I was like, oh, yep, you have that antisocial behavior. Like, that seems like that's right there. So yeah, I think that kind of like trying to step back a little bit and kind of look at like people's motivation and where that came from was an interesting common thread.
Thank you.
Yeah,
good question.
So going into a little bit more about your research process, you did a huge trip to dive into writing this book, and I must say, personally, I was super jealous reading this book and Downriver. I was like, oh my gosh, what a dream to like go on these amazing trips. But I'm sure it's very difficult at the same time. So can you talk a little bit more about your workflow on the road and some of your experiences with people and maybe some favorite anecdotes?
Yeah, I do feel super, super, super lucky that I get to do this and call it work. And it is, there is a way that you do have to incorporate workflow in this. And, it's not just like I'm on a ski trip and I'm just skiing all day and then going and hanging out and eating pizza and nachos and passing out and doing the same thing the next day. Like there is a level that you have to be reporting and taking notes and observing and then going back and logging all your notes and writing up what you did each day and recording, transcribing interviews. So it was amazing, and it was also sort of exhausting. Like I don't think I could have sustained the trip for all that long. But I live in Seattle these days, and I did a big loop. I drove out. I spent a little bit of time on the East Coast. I did most of the research for this book over the winter of 2018, 2019. I spent a little bit of time on the East Coast, kind of early season, and then set off on this big road trip. I went to Montana first. I went down into Wyoming, dinked around there, spent a couple of months kind of cruising back and forth between Utah and Colorado, chasing storms. Went down to New Mexico for a little bit, came back up through Idaho. Yeah, I mean, it was like, well, one of the questions that comes up a lot, which I think is tied to that, like, when did you give up on the ski bum question, was, how easy was it to slip back into that mode of being on the road and crashing with, friends of friends and randoms. And in some ways, this is why I don't know if I can let go of the ski bum moniker. Like, it was a little too easy to, slide into town and text a friend of a friend and ask if I could sleep on their couch for a couple days, because that was sort of part of the storytelling, part of the narrative. But I think in this kind of reporting, part of the way you get good stories and part of the way you get people to open up and to tell you kind of those anecdotes and to really dig into the stuff that feels real, that you just kind of have to show up and keep showing up and sort of be the one who's like sitting there in the parking lot or on the chairlift and just kind of hanging and waiting till, the stories start to come out. And so I had the kind of ability and the latitude to do that and the time to do that. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but I think a lot of it was just to dig in and to get people to trust you. You kind of have to be on the ground and you have to be spending time in these places. And so it's a total privilege to get to do that. And yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any like really classic best anecdote-y stories. I got stuck in Silverton for about a week, which I think is like ends up kind of being the framework for the last chapter of the book. And I have a friend of a friend who's an avalanche forecaster down there, and he said, in November when I was planning the trip, he had kind of said that I could come and stay with him whenever I wanted. And so I called him up and was like, hey, I'm Jeff, I'm coming to town. He's like, well, there's like 4 other guys staying right now. I'm teaching an avalanche class, there's a bunch of people around. And so but I didn't really have anywhere else to go, and I really wanted to be in Silverton for this storm. So I ended up kind of wedging myself into the floor with a bunch of different guides and people who were doing this Abbey 3 class. And I feel like that was sort of, I was at the kind of end of the trip, and I was really deep into this, like, I'm just going to show up and whatever happens, happens. And I ended up getting probably the best skiing of the whole trip in that little stint in Silverton, just because I was like, I can sleep in the corner, I can sleep on the floor, I can still do this ski bum dirtbag thing. I think there's a lot of kind of good little slices like that.
That's pretty sweet. So a follow-up question to that, I wanted to kind of talk about your lens as a female skier, because it seems like even the moniker ski bum elicits in my mind someone who identifies as male. And so how did you, as a young woman growing up, and then obviously a woman now, navigate such a male-dominated environment and sport?
Yeah, that's something I think about, I think every time I go skiing, or it's like such a piece of how I, depending on who I'm out on the mountain with, or, you know, if I'm out skiing around with a group of friends, if I'm on a reporting trip or something like that, that's always like part of my framework for thinking about who I am as a skier. And I thought a lot, you know, one of the big questions of this book is like, who gets to call themselves a skier? Who counts as a skier? Who is that? You know, like you said, when you think about that ski bum archetype, who is it who comes to mind first? And so often it is a, like, you know, white, probably wealthy, able-bodied, straight, you know, fit man. And I think to, you know, like, thinking about that kind of archetype and how it isn't sustainable, and also like how I fit into that was a big part of the book. And, you know, like, I fit all those archetypes for the most part, except for gender. And in some ways that can be a tool, you know, like, sometimes I think about how, or I think, to back up a little bit, I think when I first moved to the mountains and I was sort of like unsure of my skiing and nervous about how I fit in, and really wanted to be, you know, like, really wanted to be a skier, and a, you know, like a real core skier, I always wanted to be the only girl. I was like so defensive of that, like, position as the girl who could hang. And I think that is one of those things that's kind of enforced by ski movies, by stereotypes. You look at, like, most kind of, you know, a matchstick movie or TGR movie or something like that, so often there's one woman in that story. And the same is true about, like, Out Cold or Aspen Extreme, you know, like all these sort of like narratives of what skiing looks like. There sort of is like one woman. So I think for a long time I was really insecure about my position in that world, and spiky about, you know, like, being the person who could hang. And that's something that I think one of the things that seems kind of like the coolest and most exciting to me about skiing now is, like, kind of the people who are coming up in the ski world. And there's so many women who are doing really cool things in terms of as athletes or guiding or, you know, running ski areas. And I think that, you know, maybe even faster than other facets of privilege, I think that the way women are kind of making a mark in the ski industry feels really exciting and cool right now. And I'm almost like jealous of, you know, people who are just getting into it now, because I feel like they have such a better peer group to look at and learn from. And, you know, at this point in my life, I'm like, one of the best things that's come out of skiing for me is like the women I've met along the way, and the friend group, and the people who have, like, been in it with me. And I wish I hadn't been so spiky and defensive and sort of like elbows out as like the one girl for so long. But I think it's hard to break those narrative tropes and to kind of like not, you know, there's like, it's such a stereotype, but it's like, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think for so long, what we saw in the stories we're told were like, you can only be Ingrid Backstrom. and there's no other way to be a woman in skiing. So yeah, that feels like something that I have struggled with for a long time, and it also feels like something that's changing in interesting ways. Yeah, I'd be curious if there's like younger people in the room. I'd be curious about that perspective. Maybe that's you, Taylor.
Yeah, to the audience.
You're older than me.
You don't ski. So what drew you to come out tonight?
I'm pretty interested in riding in the like combination of recreation and environmental riding. So that's what brought me here.
Sweet.
And I'll just play off of the gender thing and, you know, maybe how things are different now, but I find that skiing with a group of women I love doing that. You know, I love skiing with male friends as well, but it's a really supportive, awesome culture to ski with a lot of women, and there's a lot of really strong, amazing women in this area and lots of spots in Colorado. So I think that's a nice change. You mentioned, you know, it seems like more and more women are coming up in the sport. I think we still have a long way to go with other minority sectors that you mentioned all the archetypes, and I think there's a long way to go with having more racial diversity abilities, you know, on the slope. So that, I think there's a long way to go. And I think I liked what you said about the shifting baseline of nostalgia. You know, we all are mourning for the good old days. It's getting more crowded. Housing is tough. But on the flip side of that, you know, more people are able to access the sport. So it is this delicate balance.
Yeah, that's something I'm thinking about a lot, you know, not just in skiing, but in any kind of outdoor access. You know, how do you balance trying to make it as open and equitable and to bring in as many people as possible? You know, I want everyone to have the experience that I have and have been able to have, and how do you balance that with giving people, you know, isolation, wilderness, or like that feeling of being able to afford it or not being crowded? Like, how do we manage access and carrying capacity and experience? And it's such a, you know, you talk about balancing recreation issues and environmentalism. It's such a tricky needle to thread, such a thorny question that's tied to all these questions about equity and access and affordability and who gets, you know, who gets to consider themselves an outdoors person. So I think that to me feels like one of the biggest future questions. Like, how do we try and balance all that stuff?
I guess I have a question that ties into that. You know, now I've lived in ski towns the majority of my life now, but it looks so different than when we were scanning tickets and Vail and slinging pizzas at plazas. You know, now I have 2 kids and a professional job and a house, and I have different responsibilities and obligations. So one of the things I struggle with is kind of belonging in a community that's really extreme, and people, you know, their prestige is measured by how much they can ski. And I'm skiing Red Lady, you know, 50 laps with my 6-year-old. And do I really even, you know, kind of belong here? Because I can't take advantage of all the huge mountains that are around here. I have different, you know, priorities pushing on my time. And kind of wondering, as you were developing this theme of like ski bums and aging ski bums, if you saw the flip side of that coin of people who kind of walked away from that and then are now looking, even though they're still here in this town, are kind of from the outside looking in.
Yeah, no, I think that I mean, one of the things that we talk about, this sort of like nostalgia and glorifying, but one of the things that felt super interesting was like, we tend to really glorify those people when they're young and, you know, like in their 20s and super hot shit and doing whatever. And then when they're like old and are like, you know, the super crusties who've been doing it forever, but like the people in the middle part of their lives, like, don't get the stories, don't get the attention. And I think that I think there's 2 things to what you're saying that feel really interesting to me. And one of them is like trying to balance skiing with everything else and being like, okay, this is the thing that's been a part of my life that is super important, but how does it fit in the hierarchy with work and with family and with other priorities? And then also, which I think is sort of this like impossible question that everyone has to figure out for themselves. And like, there's no perfect if I'd been like, here's the formula for how to do it, like this would have been a self-help book. It would have been super different. But I think the other question, and this is one that needles me still, and it always has, is this sort of idea of comparison, and which I think becomes this really, really, really hard part of living in a ski town, of being in these communities, is that it's so, when you're living in this place where everyone is kind of always pushing the boundaries and pushing the edge and going, you know, like, you can't just run a 5K, you have to run a 100K, or like whatever, you know, like whatever the metric might be, that there's always somebody who's like going harder and doing better than you, or like it feels like I struggle with this a lot, like kind of feeling like I wasn't a good enough skier and couldn't keep up. But that comparison factor can become so toxic, especially when that sort of like the token for how you fit into society and how you kind of like piece into the community or something like that. And that's, you know, one of the big chunks in the back of the book is about mental health in a bunch of different capacities, whether that's, you know, dealing with trauma, or whether that's, you know, a lot of these communities have really high rates of, you know, suicide and mental health issues. And so often that, or not so, maybe so often isn't exactly the right word, but one of the factors in that is this kind of idea of like trying to keep up with the Joneses and feeling like you're never enough and feeling like you can't keep up with you know, with everyone else who's like totally awesome and shredding and having the best day ever and is doing it in this totally effortless manner and isn't struggling to pay rent, or, you know, whatever the factors might be. And that becomes this really toxic factor. And I mean, I think it's true everywhere, but I think it can be really, really concentrated in these places where people are achieving, you know, like aggressively achieving, and the baseline is totally different than it might be somewhere else. So I think, yeah, I think that feeling is a really important piece of what life is like in these places. And it's also something that's really hard to talk about. I think especially in a culture that like we're all Instagramming our awesomest day ever, it's really hard to be like, hey, actually, like, I don't want to go hard. I'm having a hard time. This doesn't feel fun. And, you know, like, I think those conversations are starting to change a little bit, but it still feels like a really hard thing to kind of like break the seal on.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in here and say thank you for including so much about mental health, because here in the Gunnison Valley, our newspaper reported that there's been a 500% increase in emergency room admits due to behavioral issues. So it really hits close to home, and I'm curious if the pandemic has played into this. I mean, obviously you were writing before the pandemic, but do you think it's the conversation around mental health and bringing that to the community's consciousness is a little bit easier since those issues have become so prominent in the pandemic? Sorry, this was a long-winded question, but
No, I think it's important. Yeah, I think I think that I'd be curious if it's becoming less taboo, if people are talking about it more. I think I mean, this is totally like anecdotal, but I think it feels like it's becoming part of the kind of bigger conversation in a lot of ways right now. And I think, I mean, the pandemic has been terrible for so many reasons, but I think one of the reasons is that it's like people are so isolated and so lonely, and it's so hard to, you know, one of the big factors for, you know, quality mental health is community connection and having people to, you know, like having people who have your back and having people to talk to when you're having a hard time. And I think we're all struggling with that on top of all the other things that feel hard right now. I think that is a really crucial struggle. And I don't know if I could totally say like how much the pandemic has changed the conversation, or how that, you know, like I'd be curious, are those stats from within the last year or two, or I'd be curious about that.
The last stat specifically was fall of 2020.
Yeah.
And I don't have any statistics about suicide rates here in the valley, but I would say they're probably comparable to the other ski towns you've researched.
Yeah, and I mean there's a guy in Utah he's the state suicidologist because they've had such really high rates. There's all these factors, and there's sort of like he ran me through kind of what the risk factors are, and it's it's isolation, it's access to drugs and alcohol, it's lack of community, it's comparison, it's economic strife, and it's like all these factors that are part of our lives, and then a lot of them that have become way more compressed in the pandemic. So I think, yeah, I'm sure it's related. And I think, one of the, I did most of this, like I was saying, I did most of the reporting for the book in 2018 and 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and I was like, oh God, who's going to want to read a book about skiing when there are so many other more important things going on, and bigger crises is what we have that we should be thinking about. But I think part of why it still felt interesting and relevant was that a lot of these things that are so compressed in ski towns feel like they're part of a conversation that's about much more than skiing. And so I think that's one of them that we have in places like where you guys are, like there is sort of like a compressed lens around it, but these are all like big picture issues.
Yeah, and one more related to that, and then I'll throw it back to the audience. What kind of feedback, and have you gotten any pushback because you included these tough topics?
I haven't really gotten too much pushback. I'm curious to see if like that Vale and Altera will come for me. But yeah, I think for the most part, I don't think I necessarily like uncovered something that people weren't talking about. I think a lot of this is just like putting the issues next to each other and showing how they are related. I mean, I'm sure there's been some feedback where people are like, I wanted to read about skiing. I don't want to read about housing. And like, great, go read another book. Like this is the one. This, I don't know, like this, I haven't had anyone really coming for my throat yet, and maybe they're coming, but I mean, you can't make everyone happy, I guess. Like that doesn't seem that interesting to me.
Sweet. Well, you guys?
Yeah,
Go ahead. You didn't get it.
I was gonna say not so much a question, but just a comment of I really appreciate you like putting this not so rosy colored lens to your stories. I think when I moved to Crested Butte, we all come in, I think, with the charm and it's Whoville, and I always talk about Crested Butte and Whoville because it is to some extent that there's always this other story. And I think a lot of my friends who are on the Front Range or are doing life in other places are like, oh, you're living this amazing life, you get to ski all the time. And I'm like, yeah, but there's all these other things, and I think we touched on them, like the mental health aspects, or that you almost have to earn your friendship in a town like this to prove that you can be in their ski group and things like that. So I think it's really cool that you were able to kind of show the other side of the story. And I think highlighting a big theme right now, there isn't any right way, which I like that you kind of put that in your book of, yes, you chose to have kids. Yes, you chose to move to Seattle, but what you're doing isn't right or wrong. And I think that's something that, especially my generation in like my late 20s, moving to 30s, is like figuring out that there isn't a right way to live life. And if you want to identify as a ski bum or not, that's up to you and how you want to do that and make your money. But I think that's cool that you were able to kind of like insert all those messages in kind of a clear way. And so, yeah, I'd love to have coffee like 5 billion times with you and just go through all these different concepts.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot, because it's hard to, I mean, like one of my big fears in this was like getting it wrong. So that's really awesome to hear. And I think that like there's no right way to do it, and like anything can be like really beautiful and wonderful and also shitty at the same time. Like nothing is like one or the other. So it felt important to like be able to show, talk about all the sides of that.
The term ski bum is evolving too, where it's like you're getting creative. Like there's the people who are working remotely and making it work out, or they work 5 jobs. So it's like a time where the evolution of, ski bum is continuing to go on.
Yeah. A lot of people have asked me, they're like, well, is the ski bum dead? Like, is it over? And I think maybe the like guy who just worked in the tune shop and like did one job and lived in like the trailer and like whatever, Aspen Extreme is a bad example, but I think maybe there is an archetype that doesn't exist anymore, but I think there's always like some new evolution of it.
I was gonna say something else, but I wanted to put on that too. Just those, that's not unique to skiing, that like bomb culture thing, like they're the dirt bags when they're climbers, they're the river rats when they're boating,
Totally.
And so the theme of your book reminds me a lot of other work that's been done in those other recreational areas, like Valley Uprising is the documentary about the Yosemite climbers that used to like live there, and now that's really not possible. They're totally breaking the law to do it. So anyway, did you draw any inspiration from things like Valley Uprising from other recreational areas?
Yeah, totally. And it is like, I think that's such a good example of like, you can't, like, you have to get a reservation to camp there now. Like the framework has totally changed. And I think that I think skiing is, also this is like my place, but I think skiing is, the way skiing is sort of like consolidated around specific places, I think is sort of specific. But there is like, this sort of like scraping by culture and sort of like counterculture, dirtbags living, like living in our vans, I think is so part of this, like, it's almost this like American, like cockeyed American dream myth. So I'm trying to think, I'll think about if there's like pieces or books that like really tipped me off. There's a surfing book called Welcome to Paradise, Now Go to Hell. That's sort of about Hawaii and like that kind of culture that I thought it's a guy, Chad Smith, and he's just like a really good, gritty, fun writer. But there's definitely like a bunch of different, sectors have their stories like this.
That's a good recommendation.
Do you see that book over there called Hector Trash?
Oh. And then my other question for you, and I admit I feel like I'm behind this group here because I did not get a chance to read your book before this. I plan to read it after. I know, I just confessed. So I know your book Downriver, you've looked at water issues in your work before, and I wonder, if you do touch on this in the book Powder Days, but just wondering about your take or what you've seen as far as, skiing being in the conversation of climate change, and something like, for example, I'm kind of grappling with right now is the snowmaking. And Matt over here and we were just talking about this, like, sure, they're pulling it from the river, but then it's going to melt and go back into the water table. But, it just seems like we're in denial, like we're holding to these traditional opening dates when we don't have the snow here. And I just wonder if that's something you looked at over the years, and what your take is on that. Is the ski culture like trying to, not be in denial, but kind of combat like what's real, what's happening.
No, that's a huge piece of the book, and it is, I think there's so much, like, the reality of what skiing is going to look like. Even there's a big report that just came out in Nature in the last week or the week before about climate modeling the future of snow, and they're basically saying like a lot of places are going to have no snow by the end of the century. And that's like, this is another thing where I feel like skiing sort of like the little canary in the coal mine, where it's like, we could have no snow, the industry could die, that sucks, but also what does that mean for water? What does that mean downstream? And I think the ski industry maybe hasn't been exactly head in the sand, but has been slow to move on a lot of kind of climate questions, and especially policy stuff, because it's scary to, this is true of climate and everything. I think it's really scary to acknowledge the reality of it when it's going to hit your bottom line that much. So I think for a long time, even up until 4 or 5 years ago, resort managers, kind of upper level people weren't talking about it. They're still probably not taking it as seriously as they could, but I think the ski industry is. behind the ball on making things change. And I think I talked to a guy who's a meteorologist, this guy Joel Kratz, who's based in Boulder, about this a lot. He's kind of like my little, meteorology guru. And he was like, some places we're going to lose a lot of places, like the little New England ski hills that I grew up skiing are really vulnerable because they're low, they're warm, they don't maybe have infrastructure to make snow, which is a stopgap. But there are some places that might do better, like places that are high and cold and do have deep pockets. As skiing changes, they're maybe going to see more traffic. And that's just like I feel like that's another one of those kind of future frameworks that feels icky, but that's probably true about how we're going to have to adapt to climate change and, try and mitigate our impacts, but also have to change our behaviors. And I think, I'm in Washington right now. We've had basically no snow this year, and we've had a bunch of like really hot rain events. And Crystal, where I ski the most, was supposed to open 2 weeks ago, and they opened for like a half day this weekend. So like it's happening now. And I'm sure, like maybe you guys have some storms lined up, but it feels like it's like a brutal start to winter everywhere. And that's a reality that we have to adapt to, and it's something that hits every piece of skiing. I mean, that's like, we talk about the economic impacts, the mental health, all that stuff, but like none of that stuff, to me, climate change is sort of like the very top level issue. Like none of that stuff is part of the conversation if we don't have snow and we don't have water.
Heather, a very like nuts and bolts question. In your research, did you find that skiing as a sport is becoming more or less popular? And my only kind of context for that is, I think it was like 6 weeks ago that Vail Resort stock hit an all-time high. I don't know how that can be if skiing is becoming less popular.
I think the NSAA, the National Skiers Association, releases numbers on that every year, and it's been sort of like at a steady clip for the past, I think, 10 years. Skiing peaked like in the late 70s, early 80s, and then it's sort of been, I think that's right, and then it's sort of, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it sort of is like eking along now. And I think it kind of like sort of like that climate question where it's like, there might be the same number of skiers, but they might be more concentrated at certain places. Somewhere might feel, Christmas there might feel really crowded. And I don't know off the top of my head, I can look into this and find the numbers and send them along, but I don't know if that is total skier visit, if they measure individual skiers or total skier visits, the numbers that I'm thinking about. But yeah, I think there has been, or like, there's a narrative or something I've heard about, like skiing is dying, like the boomers, when the boomers die off, skiing is screwed. And I don't think that, I think they are like the biggest, demographic of skiers, but I don't think that it's like skiing is dropping off a cliff currently.
You think it's becoming more accessible?
I don't know. It doesn't. Yeah, I really don't know. I think there's conversations around opening it up to people beyond that traditional archetype of the ski bum that are changing it. But I also think it's becoming less economically accessible. When you talk about like the feeder resorts and you talk about how much one day walk up window ticket is, if you get an Icon Pass or an Epic Pass, maybe that amortizes over time, and if you can ski 40 days, your daily ski rate is low. But I think if you're somebody who's like maybe a beginner skier is just going to try it out, I think the barrier to entry is high, and I think that limits the pathways. And I think that's a problem for like a lot of ways of being outside. Skiing is the baseline is really high for skiing, but it's not just skiing.
Sweet. So I'll ask you one final question. I want to respect your time, even though this conversation has been really great. What do you see happening in the future with skiing?
I can't answer that question in 1 minute. What was Sorry, I didn't hear that. What was that?
Will it ever snow again?
Hard telling. Yes, it will
Yeah.
snow again, but maybe not that much, maybe not for that long. Yeah, I think the future of skiing really does depend on snow. I think I'm really curious to see, because I think it could go a lot of ways. I think we are at kind of an interesting tipping point in skiing. And so yeah, I don't have a good crystal ball prediction, but I think that it does feel like a lot of things need to change soon. So I think change is coming for skiing. Sorry, that was a really vague answer, but yeah, I can't predict.
So I know skiing wouldn't survive without snow, but what about ski towns? Because it feels like there's no off season anymore, and I don't know if people come for the lifestyle as much as the skiing sometimes, it feels like. So I personally feel like Crested Butte would be fine, or eventually it would be fine without skiing, because we'd be a mountain bike town, or, you know, even more than we already are. So what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that is true. I think that's true. I think it also makes it hard. I talked to some people who are like housing policy people, and they kind of said that housing became hard when a lot of these towns went from being just ski towns to being year-round towns. Because I think then there's obviously, second homeowners, Airbnb, all these other things for factors. But I think that a lot of these places could easily become year-round towns, summer towns. But I think that there's gonna be an interim period where it's hard, and I think that you gotta pull back, like what are people doing for work, what's kind of keeping the engine of tourism going. Yeah, I think you're probably totally right. It's just I think change is hard. I feel like I have not given you guys anything like positive or uplifting to go out into your night with.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
The town of Crested Butte is going through, they're calling it their community compass right now. And it's basically setting priorities for the next, I think, 10 years is the time frame they're looking at. So they're doing this exhaustive like community engagement process. They're at every event. They're holding virtual town halls and this, that, and the other thing. And basically asking the community, what should we as community leaders prioritize time and taxpayer dollars, and what do we want this community to look like in 10 years? I think it's kind of similar to, can Crested Butte survive without being a ski town? But I guess in your ideal world, and knowing that maybe the ski bum archetype is no longer alive, but the dream is changing. So what does the dream maybe look like for Heather Hansman in 10 years? And yeah.
Find her some affordable housing in Crested Butte. I think I think that feels like a really big deal, that they're like really trying to reach out to the community, because I think having that level of engagement and having the people who live in places make decisions and kind of try and chart the future feels like a positive change. I think a lot of these places, I think urban planning is going to be a big part of the change. Can we build these places? Do you get rid of the kind of, cutesiness of Whoville and make places more dense? Do you create different kinds of job opportunities? Like, how do you make those places not just dependent on one kind of service level job? How do you make wages, equal out to what people need to live in those towns? I think that community, the Compass program, seems really cool. I know nothing about it, but the fact that there is community engagement feels like a big step towards talking about what places might need.
It is a big deal. It's interesting though, like they hold virtual meetings and there's maybe 20 people that attend. So,
I think this is actually something that I've been thinking about a lot. It's been one of the takeaways for me, is that I was talking to a guy in Aspen, and he was like, the problem with ski bumming is that it's anti-citizenship, and like part of the like image of that is that you're like living under the radar and you're not paying for anything, and you're like you don't want to deal with, you're kind of like sneaking out to go skiing, and that inherently means that things change around you. And I think that like tilting at windmills, yelling about how things are changing, but not actually doing anything to change it into what you want it to be is like the biggest problem with the idea of ski bumming. And I think a lot now about how like, like my generation, we're the grown-ups now, and like we have to, if we want to make it good, like we have to do that. So I think that is one of the things like for me personally has been a big takeaway in all this is like, okay, if you want it to not go away, like what are you going to do about it?
There was your positive ending note.
Yeah. Everybody go vote.
Should always end it with voting.
All right, cheers, Heather. Thank you so much
Awesome.
for.
Thank you guys. Yeah.
And
I'm like, everyone feel free to reach out if you have more questions. I'm always happy to talk about this for a long time.
all right, and one more thing. I heard a rumor that you were going to be coming to Crested Butte later this winter. Jen from Townie Books told me that. Is that true?
We've been talking about something. There's nothing in the calendar yet. I'm planning to be in Colorado for all of January. But yeah, there's nothing locked down yet, but it's in conversation and I will let you guys know.
Okay, we'll stay tuned. Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. I'm just trying to see myself.